I went to the Olympic Peninsula in 1982 to record dying Native American languages, believing I was racing against time to save human history. I was wrong. The most important voice in those woods didn't belong to a human at all. One stormy night, an elderly Bigfoot appeared at my cabin door, not with a roar, but with a complex, structured language that no one had ever documented. I spent that summer recording the last testament of a vanishing civilization, holding a secret that could either rewrite science or destroy an entire species. Before we dive into this story, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you are interested in other stories about Bigfoot, please subscribe to the channel. The rain in the Olympic Peninsula didn't wash things clean, it preserved them, sealing the forest in a layer of moss and mist that felt millions of years old. It was 1982, and I had traded my tenure-track office at the University of Washington for a damp, drafty cabin 20 miles from the nearest paved road. My name is Dr. Edward Chen, and at 58 years old, I was a man obsessed with the sounds of the dying, not the physical rattle of death, but the silence that follows when a language takes its final breath. I wasn't there for the scenery. I was there to catch ghosts on magnetic tape before they vanished forever. My sabbatical was supposed to be a time of rest, but for a linguist, silence is an enemy. I had brought my heavy Nagra reel-to-reel recorder, boxes of blank tapes, and a lifetime of training in phonetics and syntax. My mission was desperate and specific: to document the fragmented dialects of the coast Salish peoples, languages that were evaporating as the elders who spoke them passed away. I felt the weight of every ticking second. Every time an 80-year-old woman in a nursing home died, a library burned down. I was the librarian trying to Xerox the pages while the building was already on fire. The cabin was a workspace, not a home. Papers were stacked on every flat surface, phonetic charts, lexical trees, and hand-drawn maps of tribal boundaries that no longer existed. The smell of the place was a mixture of old paper, wet wool, and the dark, loamy scent of the cedar forest pressing against the windows. I drank instant coffee that tasted like battery acid and spent my nights listening to the hiss of the tapes, playing back the voices of the last speakers, trying to decode the worldview hidden in their grammar. It was lonely work, but I preferred the company of verbs and nouns to the politics of the faculty lounge. I believed then, as I do now, that a language is not just a tool for communication. It is a lens through which the soul sees the world. When a language dies, we don't just lose words. We lose a specific way of understanding time, color, kinship, and God. The Makah have words for the specific angle of a wave. The Lushootseed have verb tenses that indicate whether information is firsthand or hearsay. To let these systems vanish was a crime against human consciousness. I was determined to save what I could, to build an ark of words to carry these cultures into a future that had no room for them. The locals in Forks thought I was eccentric, a city professor chasing shadows in the rain. They were kind enough, warning me about the mudslides and the bears, and occasionally teasing me about the Bigfoot legends that drew the tourists in the summer. I dismissed those stories with the arrogance of a man of science. To me, Bigfoot was folklore, a cultural construct no different than the boogeyman, interesting only in how the myth reflected the fears of the storytellers. I was interested in the real history of the land, spoken by human tongues, not the tall tales of monsters in the woods. My routine was rigid. I would drive my battered station wagon to the reservations during the day, sitting in kitchens with linoleum floors, interviewing grandmothers who switched between English and their native tongues. I recorded their stories, their songs, and their recipes. I watched their eyes cloud over as they reached for words they hadn't spoken in decades. Then I would return to the cabin, the silence of the forest feeling heavier each night. I was an archivist of loss, collecting the final echoes of civilizations that had been silenced by history. The isolation of the deep woods began to affect me. Without the constant hum of the city, my senses sharpened. I started to hear the subtle differences in the wind, the way the rain sounded different on hemlock needles versus fern fronds. The forest felt aware. It wasn't the empty backdrop I had studied in books. It was a presence. Sometimes, sitting on my porch with a cigarette, I felt like I was being watched from the tree line. I told myself it was just the solitude playing tricks on a tired mind, or perhaps a cougar stalking a deer, but the feeling was distinctly intelligent. I focused on the work to keep the unease at bay. I was analyzing a particularly complex glottal stop in a dialect that only 3 people left alive could speak. I replayed the tape over and over, slowing it down, trying to transcribe the sound. The human voice is a miracle of biology, a precise orchestration of breath and muscle. I marveled at the resilience of these speakers, holding on to their identity through the architecture of their sentences. I didn't know then that I was preparing myself for a linguistic challenge that would shatter everything I knew about biology and humanity. May arrived with a storm that shook the cabin to its foundations. The power lines went down in the first hour, plunging my world into the gray light of a kerosene lamp. The wind roared like a freight train, snapping branches and hurling them against the roof. I sat at my desk, guarding the Nagra recorder like a holy relic, hoping the roof wouldn't cave in on my life's work. The storm isolated me completely. The road was washed out. The phone line was dead. I was just a speck of biology in a churning ocean of violent geology. In the lull between the thunderclaps, I heard it. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a bear. It was a vocalization, loud and piercing, cutting through the noise of the storm. It came from the ridge just above the cabin. It wasn't a scream. It was a call. A phonetically complex, structured call. My linguist's ear pricked up instantly, bypassing my fear. That wasn't an animal noise. That was a sentence. I grabbed the recorder, shoved a fresh battery pack into it, and ran to the window, staring out into the lashing rain, wondering who or what was singing to the storm. My sabbatical wasn't a vacation. It was a rescue operation. In the academic world, we talk about moribund languages, a clinical term that masks the tragedy of the reality. A language is considered moribund when it is no longer being learned by children. It is a fire that has stopped spreading and is now just burning down to the embers in the hearths of the elderly. I came to the peninsula because the Klallam and Quiluta dialects here were flickering out. I was racing against biology, trying to capture the intricate grammars and unique phonemes on magnetic tape before the vocal cords that knew how to produce them fell silent forever. I spent my mornings driving the winding, fog-slicked roads to the reservations, my station wagon loaded with recording equipment that cost more than the car itself. I sat in small, overheated living rooms, drinking weak tea with men and women in their 80s and 90s. These were the terminal speakers, the last living repositories of thousands of years of cultural evolution. When I clipped the microphone to their collars, I felt the immense weight of the moment. I wasn't just recording sounds. I was trying to archive a specific way of being human that was about to vanish from the earth. To the uninitiated, my obsession might seem trivial. Who cares if a specific conjugation of a verb dies out? But I knew that each language carries a unique cognitive map of the universe. The languages I studied had words for the relationship between the river and the salmon that English simply couldn't capture. They had grammatical structures that forced the speaker to acknowledge the source of their knowledge, whether they saw it, heard it, or inferred it. Losing these languages was like losing a primary color from the spectrum. The human experience was becoming duller, flatter, and more uniform with every death. The locals in Forks didn't quite understand the urgency. To them, I was just the strange professor living in the old Miller cabin. They were more interested in the tourists who came up here looking for Bigfoot. I remember a waitress at the diner asking me, completely serious, if I had seen any giant footprints in the mud. I laughed and told her I was hunting for something far more elusive than a Bigfoot. I was hunting for the past. I viewed the Bigfoot legends as a distraction, a campfire story for people who were bored with reality, whereas I was terrified that reality itself was disappearing. My work required a meditative patience. Back at the cabin, I would spend hours listening to the playback, wearing heavy headphones that clamped my head like a vice. I transcribed the sounds into the International Phonetic Alphabet, turning the fluid music of speech into rigid symbols on a page. It was tedious, back-breaking work. I would replay a 3-second clip 50 times, trying to determine if a vowel was nasalized or not. The voices of the elders filled my cabin, a chorus of ghosts speaking to me from the spinning reels, entrusting me with their memories. The irony of my situation wasn't lost on me. I was a man who had dedicated his life to communication, yet I was living in total isolation. I had no wife, no children, only my students and my data. I convinced myself that this solitude was necessary for the work, that the distractions of a social life would only slow me down. But in the quiet hours of the night, when the tape stopped spinning, the silence of the cabin was oppressive. I was surrounded by millions of words, yet I had no one to speak to. I was a curator of a museum that had no visitors. I often thought about the concept of the last speaker. There is a profound loneliness in being the only person left on earth who can speak your mother tongue, to have no one to talk to. No one who understands your jokes or your prayers in the language of your childhood. It is a form of exile that happens without moving an inch. I saw that loneliness in the eyes of the elders I interviewed. They were stranded on an island of English, watching their culture erode wave by wave. I was building a lifeboat out of magnetic tape, but I knew it couldn't save them. It could only save the record that they had existed. The forest around the cabin became a character in my studies. The languages of the Pacific Northwest are shaped by the landscape. The constant rain, the dense vegetation, the reliance on the cedar and the salmon. You cannot separate the words from the woods. As I studied the vocabulary for the different types of rain, I began to see the environment through their eyes. The gray drizzle wasn't just weather, it was a state of being. I walked the trails with my notebook, touching the moss and the bark, whispering the indigenous names for them, trying to retrain my brain to see the world not as a Western academic, but as a part of this ecosystem. By mid-May, the pressure was mounting. One of my key informants, a 90-year-old Maka woman, had been hospitalized with pneumonia. I felt a panic that was almost physical. If she died before we finished the verb paradigms, that knowledge was gone. It would be erased, as if it never happened. I worked later and later into the night, fueled by caffeine and anxiety. The reels of tape spun like the fate's own wheel, measuring out the lifespan of a culture. I was fighting a war against entropy, and I knew that eventually, entropy always wins. Then came the night of the storm that changed the parameters of my mission. The wind was tearing at the shingles, and the power had been out for hours. I was sitting in the glow of the kerosene lamp, transcribing a story about the Stick Indians, the local spirit beings of the forest, when the noises started outside. At first, I thought it was the wind howling through the eaves. But then the sound changed. It became rhythmic. It became tonal. It wasn't the chaotic noise of nature. It was the structured sound of intent. I put down my pen and looked at the dark window, realizing that the linguistic anomaly I was about to encounter wasn't on any of my tapes. The storm broke just before dawn, leaving the forest dripping and silent, save for the rhythmic dripping of water from the cedar boughs. I stepped out onto the porch, clutching my Nagra recorder, driven by the memory of the vocalizations I had heard in the night. The mist was thick, clinging to the ground like a shroud, obscuring the tree line. I expected to find a bear or perhaps a cougar, something biological that I could categorize and dismiss. But as the fog lifted slightly, a shape materialized at the edge of the clearing that defied all my taxonomies. It was massive, bipedal, and covered in matted, silver-tipped fur. It was a Bigfoot, standing there as undeniably as the trees themselves. I didn't scream. My reaction was a strange, detached paralysis, the kind that hits you when reality fractures. The Bigfoot was old. I could tell by the way he moved, favoring his right hip and the heavy gray in his coat. He wasn't the aggressive monster of the tabloids. He looked weary, slumped against a Douglas fir, his breath pluming in the cold morning air. He seemed less like a predator and more like a tired traveler who had reached the end of a very long road. I stood frozen on the porch, a man of science confronting a myth, clutching a microphone like a shield. Then he spoke. It wasn't a growl, and it wasn't a roar. It was a stream of articulated sound that sent a shockwave through my linguist's brain. He let out a series of complex tonal vocalizations, rising and falling in pitch, punctuated by sharp glottal stops and soft, whistling fricatives. It was a sentence. I knew it in my bones. It had syntax. It had rhythm. It had the clear cadence of communication intended to convey meaning, not just emotion. The Bigfoot was speaking, and he was speaking a language that no human ear had ever recorded. My instinct took over. I wasn't afraid anymore. I was fascinated. I slowly raised the shotgun microphone, my hand shaking not from terror but from the adrenaline of discovery. I hit the record button, watching the magnetic tape begin to spin. The Bigfoot continued his vocalization, a long, mournful soliloquy directed at the empty forest. He was calling out. It was a hail, a specific type of linguistic structure used to announce presence or request a response. He waited, his ears twitching, listening to the silence. When no answer came, he let out a lower, trilling sound of disappointment. I analyzed the sounds in real time, my mind racing through the catalog of world languages. It bore no resemblance to the Salish dialects I was studying, nor to Athabascan or Chinook jargon. The phoneme inventory was incredible. He was producing sounds deep in the chest that a human vocal tract simply couldn't replicate, mixed with high-frequency whistles that bordered on ultrasonic. This Bigfoot wasn't just making noise. He was utilizing a phonological system of immense complexity. I was recording the first evidence of a non-human language, a discovery that would make the Rosetta Stone look like a grocery list. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. He was alone. The structure of his calls, the pauses for a response that never came, it was the behavior of a social animal isolated from its pack. I looked at the gray on his muzzle and the scars on his flank. He was an elder. In my work with the tribes, I had seen this exact demeanor in the terminal speakers, the old men and women who were the last vessels of their culture. This Bigfoot was the last of his kind in this valley, singing a song that no one else knew how to sing back. The scientific implications were staggering. If Bigfoot possessed language, they possessed consciousness. They possessed abstract thought, history, and culture. They weren't just cryptids, they were a people. I was looking at a member of a sovereign species that had lived in the shadows of humanity for millennia, passing down an oral tradition that we had been too deaf to hear. The monster narrative collapsed instantly. He was a linguistic subject, a keeper of knowledge, and he was standing 30 yards away from me, unaware that his voice was being immortalized on magnetic tape. I watched him shift his weight, rubbing his arthritic hip. He looked vulnerable. The legend of the Bigfoot describes an invincible giant, but the reality was an elderly being suffering from the cold and the ache of age. He picked up a pine cone and turned it over in his massive leathery hands, examining it with a dexterity that confirmed his tool-using potential. He muttered something soft, a few clipped syllables, and tossed it aside. It was a comment. He was talking to himself, a sign of high intelligence and inner monologue. I needed to get closer, but I couldn't risk frightening him. I stayed on the porch, a statue with a microphone. The tape ran out, the reel flapping loosely. I fumbled to change it, the plastic click sounding like a gunshot in the quiet morning. The Bigfoot froze. He spun around with surprising speed, his dark, deep-set eyes locking onto me. He didn't run. He didn't charge. He stood his ground, staring at the small human with the strange machine. The dynamic shifted from observation to interaction. He took a tentative step toward the cabin, sniffing the air. He saw me not as a threat, but perhaps as a curiosity. He made a sound directed specifically at me, a rising interrogative chirp. He was asking a question. My heart hammered against my ribs. I was a linguist who had spent his life saving dying words, and now the most impossible speaker on earth was standing in my front yard, waiting for me to say something back. The days that followed that first contact blurred into a fever dream of scientific revolution. The Bigfoot returned to the clearing every morning at dawn, emerging from the mist like a monk arriving for matins. He wasn't looking for food. I left apples and bread on the stump, but he often ignored them. He was looking for an audience. I set up my equipment on the porch, the Nagra recorder, a directional microphone, and a notepad. We established a fragile, invisible boundary at the edge of the stairs. I sat on my chair, he sat on the wet moss, and the most important linguistic fieldwork in human history began. I started with the basics of lexicography, pointing and naming. I would point to a stone and say, "stone." The Bigfoot would watch me, his head cocked, and then make a low, rumbling sound. "Kurtak." I would point to the cedar tree. "Sule." It wasn't mimicry, it was translation. He understood the concept of labeling the physical world. He wasn't just reacting to stimuli, he was engaging in a symbolic exchange. Every word he gave me was a brick in the wall of proof that I was building, proof that the being sitting in my yard was not a cryptid to be hunted, but a conscious entity to be interviewed. Back inside the cabin, I spent my nights analyzing the tapes with a fervor that bordered on mania. I drew phonetic charts, mapping the vowels and consonants of his speech. The complexity was humbling. His language utilized a whistled register for long-distance communication and a guttural sub-bass register for intimate proximity. The grammar appeared to be agglutinative, stacking suffixes onto root words to convey nuance. This wasn't the barking of a dog or the hooting of a chimp. This was a fully developed language system with rules, exceptions, and poetry. The implications of this grammar terrified me. In linguistics, we talk about displacement, the ability to talk about things that are not currently present. It is the hallmark of higher consciousness. On the third day, the Bigfoot gestured toward the ridgeline, where the snow was melting, and made a complex series of sounds involving a descending pitch. I analyzed it later and realized he wasn't talking about the mountain itself. He was talking about the memory of the snow from the winter. He possessed a concept of the past. He was a historian. This realization shifted my entire paradigm from zoology to anthropology. If the Bigfoot had a sense of time, a sense of self, and a language to express it, he was not an animal. He was a person. The definition of humanity suddenly felt dangerously narrow. I looked at the legal pads filled with his words and realized I was holding the Magna Carta for a new species. If they were people, they had rights. They had the right to life, to land, and to legal protection. The idea of a hunter shooting him wasn't poaching anymore, it was murder. I began to see the Bigfoot not as a subject, but as a colleague. He had a personality. He could be impatient. If I mispronounced a word, he would let out a sharp, clicking hiss and repeat it slowly, like a weary schoolteacher. He had a sense of humor, or at least irony. Once, when I tripped over my microphone cable, he made a soft, chuffing sound that was unmistakably a chuckle. These moments of connection stripped away the myth of the monster. He was just an old man, tired and lonely, trying to bridge the gap between his mind and mine. The weight of the secret grew heavier with every tape I filled. I knew that if I released this data, it would change the world. Biologists, theologians, and politicians would have to rewrite their textbooks. But I also knew what humans do to things they don't understand. I looked at the Bigfoot, sitting peacefully in the rain, and imagined him in a cage, surrounded by cameras, forced to perform for the curiosity of the masses. I was documenting his humanity to prove his worth, but that very documentation was the most dangerous weapon I could point at him. I focused on the linguistic structure of his worldview. His language had no word for ownership or property. The forest wasn't something to be possessed, it was a web of relationships. He used the same grammatical case for tree as he did for brother. To speak his language, I had to dismantle my own capitalist, colonialist mindset. I had to learn to see the world not as a collection of resources, but as a community of living things. He wasn't just teaching me vocabulary. He was teaching me a philosophy that my species had forgotten 10,000 years ago. The physical toll on the Bigfoot was evident. He was old, perhaps ancient. His movements were stiff, and his breath rattled in his chest on the damp mornings. Yet, he showed up every day, driven by an urgency I couldn't quite name. He would speak for hours, pouring words into the microphone until his voice cracked. It felt less like a lesson and more like a testimony. He was downloading his mind onto my tapes, ensuring that when his body failed, the patterns of his thoughts would survive in the magnetic rust. One afternoon, after a particularly long session, the Bigfoot fell silent. He looked up at the gray sky and let out a call, the same long, mournful hail I had heard that first morning. It was a seeking call, a request for contact using the high whistle register that carried for miles. He waited. The forest was silent. He called again, louder, the sound echoing off the canyon walls. Nothing. He slumped his shoulders, the universal posture of defeat. I realized then that I wasn't just interviewing a person, I was interviewing the loneliest being on Earth. The silence that followed the Bigfoot's unanswered calls was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was the acoustic signature of extinction. In linguistics, we have a term for the last individual who speaks a language, an endling. I looked at the massive, slumped figure on the edge of the clearing and realized I was looking at the endling of an entire species. He wasn't just calling out to a pack that had wandered off. He was calling out to ghosts. The valley was empty. The woods were empty. He was the sole survivor of a history that stretched back to the Ice Age, and he knew it with a crushing, absolute certainty. The dynamic of our sessions shifted immediately. The Bigfoot seemed to realize that no help was coming, that no other silver-tipped giants would emerge from the trees to carry his stories. He turned his attention fully to me and the spinning reels of the Nagra recorder. There was a shift in his demeanor, a desperate urgency that replaced the casual curiosity of the first few days. He stopped pausing to eat the apples I left. He stopped staring at the birds. He sat down heavily on the moss, looked directly into my eyes, and began to speak with a speed and intensity that told me he was racing against a clock I couldn't see. He understood the machine. I don't know how, but the Bigfoot grasped the function of the recorder. He would watch the tape supply reel deplete, and when it got low, he would stop speaking and point a thick finger at the box, making a chuffing sound until I changed the reel. He recognized that the machine was a vessel, a way to store the sounds he was making. To him, it wasn't technology. It was a way to cheat death. He was treating me not as a pet or a curiosity, but as a scribe. I was the monk, and he was the dying emperor dictating his final will and testament. The curriculum changed from simple vocabulary to complex, flowing narratives. The Bigfoot began to recite what I could only interpret as oral history. These were long, rhythmic chants that utilized a poetic register of his language, distinct from his conversational speech. He used repetitive stanzas and mnemonic devices, linguistic tools used by oral cultures to preserve information over centuries. He was reciting the genealogy of his people, the names of the mountains before they had English names, and the location of the seasonal camps. He was downloading the collective memory of his civilization onto my magnetic tape. I struggled to keep up. My hand cramped as I scribbled phonetic transcriptions, trying to capture the nuance of his tone. The Bigfoot was a demanding teacher. If I drifted or looked tired, he would slam his hand on the ground, a tremor that shook the porch, and bark a sharp command. He needed me to understand. He needed to know that when he was gone, this information wouldn't dissolve into the mist. It was a terrifying burden. I wasn't just a researcher anymore. I was the sole keeper of the Bigfoot legacy. If I failed, an entire sentient worldview would vanish from the universe. The physical toll of this desperation was visible on both of us. I was living on coffee and adrenaline, my eyes burning from strain. The Bigfoot was fading. His breathing was becoming more labored, a wet rattle settling deep in his chest. He would cough, a racking, violent spasm that bent his massive frame double, leaving him gasping for air. Yet after every fit, he would wipe his mouth, take a breath, and continue the recitation. He was spending his life force to buy these words. He was literally speaking himself to death to ensure he wasn't forgotten. There were moments of profound sorrow that transcended the language barrier. One afternoon, the Bigfoot was describing, I believe, the migration patterns of the salmon. He stopped mid-sentence, his voice catching. He looked at the river, then at his own empty hands, and let out a sound that wasn't a word. It was a keen, a pure vocalization of grief. He was remembering a time when the river was full, when his family was there, when the world wasn't so quiet. In that moment, the monster was just an old man mourning the loss of everyone he had ever loved. I realized that he saw me as his terminal listener. In every extinction event, there is a final transfer of data. The last passenger pigeon died in a zoo. The last thylacine died in a cage. But this Bigfoot was choosing his end. He was choosing to spend his final days not in hiding, but in communication. He had identified me, a small, fragile human with a listening machine, as the only bridge left. It was a gamble of immense proportions. He was trusting the very species that had likely decimated his kind to be the guardian of his memory. The responsibility began to keep me awake at night. I looked at the shelf of recorded tapes, dozens of them now, and realized they were the most valuable artifacts on the planet. They proved that Bigfoot existed, yes, but more importantly, they proved that Bigfoot had a soul, a history, and a literature. I was holding the proof of a parallel humanity, but with that proof came a terrible danger. The maps he was drawing with his words, the locations of the breeding grounds and the winter caves. It was actionable intelligence. As the Bigfoot launched into a new topic, a complex description of the medicinal plants of the valley, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp air. He was giving me everything. He was holding nothing back. He was teaching me how to survive in his world, how to find the hidden places, how to speak to the forest. He was giving me the keys to the kingdom because he knew the king was dying. But I knew that if the wrong people got their hands on these keys, they wouldn't use them to preserve the kingdom. They would use them to loot it. As the stack of recorded tapes grew, turning into a tower of magnetic evidence on my desk, the initial euphoria of discovery curdled into a cold, hard knot of anxiety. I sat there late one night, listening to a playback of the Bigfoot describing the Valley of the Sleeping Sun, a hidden geothermal pocket deep in the Olympic interior. My hand hovered over the map, my pen ready to mark the coordinates based on his precise linguistic triangulation. Then I stopped. The pen hovered in the air, trembling. I realized that I wasn't just drawing a map for linguistic study. I was drawing a treasure map for every trophy hunter, government agency, and biological specimen collector on the planet. The dilemma tore me apart. As a linguist, my prime directive is preservation. To let a language die is the ultimate sin of my profession. I held in my hands the Rosetta Stone of a new species, the proof that we are not alone in our sentience. If I published this data, it would be the greatest scientific discovery since Darwin. I would be immortalized. The Bigfoot would be recognized. Science would advance by a century in a single day. But as I looked out the window at the dark shape of the Bigfoot sleeping under the eaves, I knew the cost of that glory. I thought about what happens when the civilized world discovers a new people. It is never a story of peaceful exchange. It is always a story of containment, exploitation, and disease. If I released these tapes, I wouldn't just be releasing words. I would be releasing a coordinate grid. The Bigfoot was detailing migration routes, winter dens, and breeding grounds that had been secret for 10,000 years. He was handing me the keys to his house because he wanted his story told, not realizing that there were men who would burn the house down just to see what was inside. The Bigfoot trusted me. That was the knife that twisted in my gut. He sat with me every day, patiently repeating phonemes, believing that I was a guardian of his legacy. He didn't understand the voracious appetite of the human world. He didn't know about zoos or vivisection or the endless flashing of cameras. He saw me as a repository, a safe place to put his memories. If I published this work, I would be betraying that trust in the most fundamental way. I would be turning his intimate oral history into a hunting guide for his extinction. I played out the scenario in my head 1,000 times. I imagined the headlines. I imagined the helicopters descending on the valley, the tranquilizer darts, the nets. I imagined this proud, ancient Bigfoot who knew the names of the stars and the lineage of the trees, sitting in a concrete cell in a research facility, poked and prodded by men in white coats. He was the last of his kind in this valley. If I exposed him, he wouldn't spend his final days in the dignity of the forest. He would spend them as a spectacle. The thought made me physically ill, but the alternative was equally horrifying to my academic soul. To protect the Bigfoot, I would have to bury the language. I would have to let the most unique linguistic system on Earth vanish into the mist. I would have to let his history, his philosophy, and his poetry die with him. It felt like burning the Library of Alexandria to save the librarian. Was it better to let a culture be forgotten so that its last citizen could die in peace? Or was the preservation of knowledge worth the suffering of the individual? It was an ethical, impossible equation. I looked at the Nagra recorder, the machine that had become my confessor. It held the voice of the Bigfoot, capturing the nuances of a mind that was both alien and strikingly human. If I destroyed these tapes, I would be committing a crime against science. Future generations would never know he existed. They would never know that the forest had a voice. I would be the only human being to ever know the truth, and I would take that truth to my grave. It was a burden of silence that no man should have to carry. The Bigfoot, for his part, remained blissfully unaware of the danger his own words posed. He continued his lessons with a single-minded focus, correcting my pronunciation of the word for ancestor with a gentle chuff. He believed that by teaching me, He was ensuring his immortality. He didn't know that every word he taught me was a potential bullet. I found myself hesitating during our sessions, terrified to write down the specific locations he mentioned, trying to censor the record in real time. But a partial record was no record at all. I began to look at the tapes not as data, but as dangerous ordnance. I bought a heavy metal lockbox and placed it under my bed, storing the reels inside like radioactive material. I stopped sending my weekly updates to the university. I couldn't risk anyone suspecting what I had found. I became paranoid, jumping at the sound of a car engine on the distant road, terrified that someone else would stumble upon my discovery before I could decide what to do with it. The Bigfoot was safe as long as he was a myth. He was in mortal danger the moment he became a fact. The days turned into weeks, and the Bigfoot grew weaker, his coughing fits more frequent. The clock was ticking. I knew I couldn't straddle the fence forever. Eventually, the sabbatical would end, the Bigfoot would pass, and I would be left with a box of tapes and a choice that would define history. But before I could make that choice, the Bigfoot decided to deepen the lesson. He stopped talking about the past and started talking about the present. He signaled that it was time for me to stop writing and start learning to see, to understand the world not through my lens, but through his. Summer settled over the peninsula, turning the constant rain into a humid, verdant steam that coated everything in the cabin. The routine of our days became monastic in its discipline. The Bigfoot arrived at first light, his silver-tipped fur damp with dew, and took his place on the mossy patch near the porch stairs. I sat in my folding chair, the microphone positioned between us like a sacred object. We didn't exchange pleasantries. We went straight to work. The lessons were grueling, often lasting 6 or 7 hours, broken only when the heat of the midday sun forced the Bigfoot to retreat into the shade of the cedars. The Bigfoot was a rigorous pedagogue. He tolerated no laziness. If my pronunciation of a glottal stop was sloppy, he would make a sharp, correcting click, tsk-koo, and force me to repeat the syllable until it vibrated correctly in my chest. He wasn't just teaching me words, he was teaching me how to use my body as an instrument. I learned to use parts of my throat I didn't know existed, mimicking the deep, resonant infrasound that he used to communicate over long distances. My voice grew hoarse, my throat sore, but slowly, clumsy and accented, I began to speak the first stumbling sentences of a language that hadn't been heard by human ears for 10 millennia. As my proficiency grew, the lessons shifted from vocabulary to philosophy. I discovered that the Bigfoot language possessed a concept of time that was radically different from the linear arrow of the West. They didn't have a past, present, and future tense. They had a witnessed tense and a rooted tense. To speak of the past was to speak of something that was still growing, like a tree. The ancestors weren't gone, they were rooted. This grammatical structure forced me to view time as spherical, a constant accumulation of presence where the dead were still active participants in the living world. The concept of nature was non-existent in his lexicon because there was no separation between the speaker and the environment. In English we say, "I see the tree." In the Bigfoot tongue, the phrase was closer to "the tree" and "I witness each other." The grammar demanded a recognition of the agency of all things. Stones, rivers, and storms were not objects. They were subjects with their own volition. To speak this language was to step into a universe where you were never alone, where every gust of wind was a conversation and every rock was a potential kin. We spent weeks on the vocabulary of the forest canopy. The Bigfoot taught me 14 different words for the way light filters through cedar branches, each describing a specific time of day and season. He taught me the silent names of the animals, names that were never spoken aloud lest they alert the prey, but were whistled or signaled. I was learning a taxonomy that was far more precise than Linnaean biology, based not on anatomy, but on relationship and behavior. I was seeing the woods for the first time, the green blur resolving into a high-definition map of resources and relatives. The emotional weight of these lessons was crushing. There were moments when the Bigfoot would pause, his dark eyes fixed on the middle distance, and I knew he was searching for a word that he hadn't spoken since his childhood. When he found it, he would offer it to me with a trembling reverence, like handing over a family heirloom. We both understood the stakes. He was pouring the contents of his civilization into the vessel of my mind. Every session was a funeral rite for his culture and a baptism for mine. He was dying, and I was his designated survivor. I began to dream in his language. I would wake up in the night, the cabin dark, muttering strings of complex consonants, my mind trying to organize the world according to his syntax. I found English becoming clumsy and inadequate. How could I describe the smell of rain on hot stone in English without stripping it of its spiritual dimension? I was becoming a hybrid, a man straddling two cognitive realities. The Bigfoot noticed this shift. One morning, after I successfully navigated a complex grammatical mood regarding the river's flow, he reached out and touched my knee. A rare physical contact that felt like a knighthood. The barrier of species began to dissolve completely. We sat in companionable silence during the breaks, watching the jays fight over crumbs. I realized that the monster I had feared was more civilized than most of the humans I knew. He possessed a patience and a dignity that shamed me. He didn't interrupt. He didn't boast. He listened with his whole body. In the quiet of those afternoons, I realized that the Bigfoot language was designed for listening, for absorbing the world rather than dominating it. It was a language of reception, not projection. One particular lesson changed me forever. He taught me the word for human. It wasn't a slur, as I might have expected from a species we had persecuted. It was a complex term that translated roughly to the ones who forgot. It implied a tragedy, not a malice. In his worldview, humans were a lost branch of the family tree, a people who had severed their connection to the rooted time and wandered into a lonely, linear madness. He didn't hate us. He pitied us. He was teaching me his language not just to save his history, but to try and remind me of who I used to be before we forgot. As the summer waned and the fireweed began to bloom, the Bigfoot's urgency increased. He began to introduce concepts that were incredibly abstract, the metaphysics of the star people and the earth bones. He was moving from the physical world to the spiritual, rushing to give me the theology of his people before the first frost. I scribbled furiously, my hand cramping, terrified of missing a single nuance. I realized then that I wasn't just learning a language. I was receiving the blueprint of an entire cosmology, a way of understanding the universe that had allowed his kind to survive in the shadows while we burned the world down in the light. As the leaves began to turn gold in late August, the nature of our sessions transformed from linguistic cataloging to a profound transfer of civilization. I realized that the Bigfoot wasn't just teaching me a language. He was handing me the keys to an encyclopedia that had been written over thousands of years. In his tongue, the name for a specific fern wasn't just a label. It was a compound word that explained which part was edible, which part was poison, and at what moon phase it should be harvested. Every noun was a survival manual compressed into a sound. I wasn't just learning how to speak. I was learning how to live in the Olympic rainforest without destroying it. The Bigfoot's language revealed a history that predated the arrival of the European settlers, and perhaps even the First Nations. He spoke of the Great Burning, a detailed account of a volcanic eruption that I realized, with a chill, matched the geological record of Mount Mazama's collapse 7,000 years ago. His people had witnessed it. They had oral records of the ash falling like black snow, preserved in a rhythmic chant that had been passed down through hundreds of generations. I was recording an eyewitness account of the Holocene era. The Bigfoot were not just inhabitants of the land. They were its memory, the living record of the Earth's trauma and rebirth. The moral philosophy encoded in his grammar was staggering. There was no linguistic mechanism to express the concept of waste. In the Bigfoot worldview, everything had a purpose and a destination. To kill an animal and not use every part was a grammatical impossibility, a sentence that couldn't be constructed because the logic of the language rejected it. This wasn't just a rule, it was a cognitive barrier against greed. I felt a deep shame as I compared it to my own culture of excess. I was studying a savage who possessed a sophisticated ethical framework that was woven into the very syntax of his thoughts. He taught me the song lines of the forest, a complex system of acoustic maps. The Bigfoot didn't use physical landmarks like we do, they used soundscapes. A specific valley was named by the way the wind howled through its canyons. To find your way, you had to listen to the pitch of the air. This revelation explained their elusive nature. They didn't just hide visually, they navigated acoustically, moving through the silent spots where sound didn't carry. He was teaching me the physics of invisibility, a skill that had allowed his species to coexist with apex predators and human hunters for millennia. The most difficult lessons concerned his people's relationship with humanity. The Bigfoot language contained a specific set of verb forms used only when discussing humans, the danger aspect. It implied unpredictability, violence, and a lack of reason. Listening to him describe us was a humbling experience. In his stories, we were the chaos element, the fire starters, the noisemakers. We were the monsters in their fairy tales. I had to sit there, the microphone trembling in my hand, and record the indictment of my own species, realizing that from his perspective, our civilization was a dystopian nightmare of destruction. I began to understand the true weight of the translator's dilemma. I wasn't just holding a new language, I was holding the coordinates to their survival. The Bigfoot described the Winter Keep, a specific geothermal cavern system where his people, if any others survived, would retreat during the deep snows. He gave me the location. It was encoded in a poem about the Warm Breath Mountain. If I published this, I would be handing a map to every poacher in the Pacific Northwest. I looked at the tape spinning on the reels, and for the first time, I saw it not as scientific data, but as a death warrant. The conflict between my duty as a scientist and my duty as a moral being reached its breaking point. Science demands the sharing of knowledge. Publish or perish. But if I published, he would perish. The Bigfoot had given me this knowledge because he was lonely and dying, trusting me to be a vessel. He didn't understand the machinery of the modern world. He didn't know that knowledge is a commodity, and that curiosity often kills the cat. I was the gatekeeper. I held the power to grant his species immortality in the history books, or to grant them the safety of oblivion. I looked at the Bigfoot, his eyes milky with cataracts, his massive hands resting on his knees. He was the last speaker, the Aristotle of the woods. He had entrusted me with the sum total of his life's learning. If I kept his secret, the language would die with him. The beautiful, complex, moral way of seeing the world would vanish as if it had never been. It was a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions. But if I revealed it, the sanctity of his life and the lives of any remaining kin would be violated. I had to choose between the preservation of the word and the preservation of the world. The realization hit me that the language itself offered the solution. The Bigfoot had taught me the word kalaya, which means to keep a secret so deep it becomes the earth. It was a sacred duty of the guardians of the lore. To practice kalaya was the highest honor. It meant that the knowledge was safe because it was buried in the heart, not shouted from the rooftops. I realized that by recording him I had violated the spirit of kalaya. I had tried to capture the wind in a jar. The true preservation wasn't on the magnetic tape, it was in the change that had happened inside of me. On the final day of August, the Bigfoot finished his recitation. He fell silent, looking at me with a profound, heavy finality. He had emptied himself. There was nothing left to say. He gestured to the recorder, then to the fire pit where I burned my trash. He didn't speak the command, but the meaning was clear. He understood, perhaps better than I did, the danger of what we had done. He was asking me to make the ultimate sacrifice for a linguist, to destroy the data, to save the subject. He was asking me to let the silence return, to let the mystery remain a mystery.